program broadcast. It's May 30th, 2018. I think tonight's webinar broadcast is going to be interesting because this is something that I've been teaching to wilderness families for 23 years. And some of my thinking on the topic of I feel statements and effective communication has definitely evolved. I still believe that it is a fundamental principle to improving relationships. I still believe that practicing the basics, practicing the core principles involved in the I feel statement and reflective listening create or become the operationalization of healthy and intimate relationships. However, I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some differences that I've come to appreciate about this skill, this tool, this idea as time has gone on working with families all these years. So to start, I want to talk about the idea of what communication skills do, what's beneath them. Communication skills help us connect our children and ourselves. As we become more clear about the relationship between the events in our lives, our thoughts and our feelings, we'll be better able to see our children and provide them with a safe context in which to work through their difficulties. And so much more so over the years have I come to believe that communication skills are for the individual rather than the dyad or the triad or the relationship. That what it really does is it creates clarity for us. We start to become more and more aware of what's going on inside of us. I think of it like a mindfulness practice. What am I feeling? What am I observing? What am I thinking? What do I want? What can I control? What can I not control? So more powerful, more effective in helping me find myself than in creating intimacy in relationships, although it can do that, of course. First, I want to talk about the idea of meta-communication. One of the first things that therapists learn about when studying therapy is this idea of what communication really is, what's really being said. A lot of times, the most distressing thing that can happen to an individual is when what is meant and what is said don't match. And I think many of us can relate to that in our families. When somebody says something and to the outside observer, maybe on paper, it looks like they mean something. But we know because of the history, because of the context, because of the relationship, that it means something entirely different. And it can be very distressing, very upsetting. We talk about the idea of process versus content. What's really happening in the relationship when two people communicate versus the content, right? The syntax, the semantics of things. What are the words that are being used in that process? And so for both people to be more authentic, honest about the communication, there has to be some vulnerability. And aside from that, we can become more aware for ourselves and around others what is really going on. I can remember very clearly a young adult talking to a group of families in California at a parent education meeting, saying that the biggest thing that he took away from his experience in wilderness therapy was that he understood what people meant when they were talking, what they were really saying. And that's because in therapy, especially a program that requires or has so much immersion like Evoke therapy programs, you're really slowing everything down. You're putting everything under the magnifying glass or the microscope and you're looking at. And that includes everybody else in the group and yourself. There's that classic exchange that happens between the clients and the students and the staff where something happens and the staff pause and ask the student or client, what did you think? What's going on for you? What's happening right now? And in many cases, the first response is a similar kind of response that our children have given us, which is nothing. Nothing's going on. I didn't mean anything by it. And then the staff don't stop there. They pause and wait and ask follow-up question after follow-up question. And because there's no escape in wilderness, right? There's nowhere to go. There's no door to slam. We really do get at the root of it. And also we try to provide a safe context where children can be more vulnerable, can express themselves. Part of the idea of communication theory is that pathology, problems, addictions, neuroses, and symptomology very often have their roots in the unexpressed emotional pain of the individual. That may be too simple of an overarching statement, but it's something that holds true quite often. That our symptoms, right, are the way that we leak, what we leak, how it comes out sideways, is really just our unexpressed emotions, our unfelt emotions. I've said, again, kind of a simplification, but I've said before that therapy is really just learning how to feel. And because the therapist can't come to you and say, just feel, right? It's hard to just feel. We ask people to talk about their feelings, like a mindfulness activity. Share with us, to the best of your ability, what's going on for you right now. And so in a way, talking about feelings is akin to feeling our feelings. Carl Jung said neuroses is a substitute form of legitimate suffering. We use communication theory to help equip individuals and families with a tool that facilitates feeling, healing, and integration. The feeling statement is an avenue to feel, connect, choose, and change. We move from ownership. Actually, we start with probably disownership, disowning our feelings, to ownership, to choice. Once you can own something, you can then make it a choice, make it something that you work on. And I'll talk about ownership as a contrast to choosing our feelings. I think there's a misnomer out there in our society. When I hear people, sometimes even therapists and staff say, your feelings are your choice. Most of us do not experience our feelings as a conscious choice, but they are ours to own. So I'm going to start next with the idea of the wellness cycle, the shame cycle, because they give some glimpse into some underlying concepts of our communication model. The cycle of wholeness and health. This idea that start at any moment of contentment, of serenity, of peace, maybe even of nothingness. And then what comes along is either desired experiences or undesired experiences. And from the desired experiences, of course, come positive emotions, which most everybody deals well with, right? You don't have to adjust to happiness and joy for the most part. But what comes from undesired experiences is these undesired emotions, right? Hurt, sadness, pain, loneliness, fear, anxiety, insecurities, anger, depression, right? That's at the core of what goes on for us. But what we do is we protect ourselves from those, right? We create a barrier between our feeling self and the world, and we use symptoms to distract ourselves. We use symptoms to distract everybody else. One of the things that I've always found to be very profound is the idea that when we are talking about the behaviors, and in many cases, with our clients, with our children, the symptom is winning. The symptom is in place to distract everybody, not just the person displaying the symptom, but everybody around them. So it's one of the reasons why we're not symptom reduction focused, right? We follow the symptoms to the heart of the matter, which are the feelings that lie beneath it. So whether it's school refusal, stealing, lying, self-injury, substance abuse, right? Overeating, sexual promiscuity, suicidality, all of those symptoms serve to provide armor for the person. So through the process of wilderness therapy, through the process of therapy, we sit with somebody else and try to discover and talk about our feelings. And then this is really important for most of us parents. We do nothing but listen, hear, understand, remain curious, hold it, sit with it. Right? We don't pass judgment. We do our very best. We aspire to the point that we don't try to fix it or make it go away. And then through a process that we have very little to do with, the individual is able to integrate those feelings into the self, right? All of myself is made up not just of the happy moments, the exciting moments, the desired experiences, but also the pain and the sadness, the fear. It becomes a part of me. And as a whole self, I become more and more resilient. And then we go through the cycle in a day many times, over the course of our life many, many times. So this is the model. Something happens, we don't feel like we want to feel, and then there's the point of departure where we cover that, distract that feeling with a symptom, and then we eventually can come back to it through the process of talking and sharing. Similarly, the shame cycle tells us a lot about the difference between what the surface is telling us and what's going on underneath. This is a cycle that after being in wilderness therapy for a while, I identified as something that I saw over and over again with our clients, right? That these clients had a sensitivity, a capacity for empathy to read other people. And therefore, they knew how to get a positive reaction. So they performed. But in the case of performing for others, which led to this feeling of inflation, they also didn't attend to themselves what was really going on, where they might be hurting and struggling, because that behavior, that performance was reinforced, fed us with an enlarged ego. And so the real self doesn't get taken care of. The self needs are not met. Then we develop maladaptive coping strategies. The behavior increases. Many will say and experience, and I think this is an important part for parents. I've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of children say, my parents made me do it. They made me play soccer. They demanded, required that I had good grades. On and on and on. And parents, flabbergasted by that revelation, say, we thought you were happy. We thought you liked it. We just wanted you to do your best in school. But the child experiences this dynamic, this pleasing, performing, and reinforcing dynamic as control, right? They don't have conscious choice over it, so they experience it as being done to them. Resentment tends to build. This is prior to things kind of blowing up. And eventually there's a blow up, a complete disconnection, a complete departure from anything that looks like anything that the parents or the family wanted or valued, which can lead to guilt, shame, this feeling that you're letting everybody down. It's a deflated feeling. And then we go around and around and around again until we do battle with the shame, until we do battle with the forces of guilt in our lives. And it is, for most of us, a lifelong process. We first have to figure out where it came from, where that voice comes from. That when we make a mistake, that when we do something that hurts somebody, that we feel horribly. We feel overwhelmed with feelings of shame or guilt. Once we identify where that message comes from, we can do battle with it, right? We can work to leave it where it is. We can work with somebody, hopefully a therapist, a mentor, somebody to reprogram ourselves, to accept ourselves as human in a compassionate, non-judgmental way. And the fear for most people is this will lead to hedonism, acting out of all kinds. But what we know from studying mental health, from studying people, is that the departure away from guilt and shame, the honest, authentic departure, not the pseudo departure that sociopaths or narcissists or antisocial personalities exhibit, not that pseudo departure, but the authentic letting go of it leads to an increase of love and compassion towards others, because that's the only way, that's the only context that we can honestly let go of our shame and guilt. So, a little bit of that background. Things to remember in communication. It is simple but hard. It is hard to do. In fact, I always find that the difficulty with practicing simple communication skills is evidence of how important it is, how fundamental it is to what's going on in our lives and our relationship. If it was easy, it wouldn't mean that much. It wouldn't be that valuable. But using assertive, clear, effective communication is very, very hard. We're not wired, most of us, for healthy, appropriate attachment. We're wired for reactivity, dependence, right? Being triggered. We even equate some of those characteristics with love and closeness because that's what we were taught love was as children, implicitly and explicitly. The roots of communication go much deeper than we imagine. I say this often when I talk about this, when I was initially being trained as a therapist and we were going through the communication theory model, communication training model, learning about it, my thought was very arrogantly, well, this will be good for a lot of the more simple therapists, maybe the ones that aren't so bright or complex like myself, I thought. At least they'll have something to work with. I'm going to go much, much deeper than that. But the fact of the matter is this is what it looks like. This is what it sounds like when people are differentiated. And differentiation, like I've talked about recently in the broadcast, is an incredibly complex process that is hard to develop, difficult to develop. And the myriad of triggers, of buttons that we have, of messages that we're sorting out and listening to in our head, have a relationship to the communication model. I warn people to be wary of what I call the behind the back passes, the shortcuts, right? Getting tricky, thinking that you're above it, like I first thought I was above it. Understanding that there's value in the basics, in the fundamentals, like a musician or an artist of some other kind, or an athlete. The greatest of those practice the basics all the way through their entire life. If nothing else, it interrupts old patterns and habits, right? A lot of people say it feels contrived, it feels artificial, unnatural. And my response is good. That's a good thing. That means that you're trying something different, that you're stopping what is the impulse, right? Unquestioned reaction. And you're having to make it conscious. Like any new skill added to a repertoire, it's going to feel unnatural. So that's a good thing. It is simple, sometimes too simple, like I said. Sometimes we think it's beneath us. I use the example of the cellist Pablo Casals, who died at the age of 92 and was playing the scales on the day that he died. When asked why he was still playing the scales, considered too much of his life to be the greatest cello player on earth, his response was, I learn something new every day. It's that kind of humility that serves us well with communication skills also. It's okay to cheat. It's okay to reference your notes. You know, it's not a memorization game. It's not a test. And in fact, when you struggle or fumble through it initially, that can be very, for your children, that can be very empowering for them to see that they know something better than you. It takes them about 2 weeks to become really adept at the basic communication skills. Whether they use them or not, like all of us, is another story. But after about 10 days, 2 weeks of the immersion into the program, they do really well with it. I joke and say, just stick to the format. Try the format for the next 20 years. And then when you get really good at it, start to vary it a little bit more. But again, the core elements of the I feel statement and reflective listening, I use all the time. And it's amazing how hard it is to shift from you made me feel, or you're being a jerk or unreasonable, choose the adjective, to I feel this way when this happens. It's so hard to own it as mine. I'm much more comfortable with making it about my wife, my children, my friend, than I am taking ownership of it. Give it a chance to teach you, right? Give it a chance to show you something different about yourself. in your relationships. And perhaps most importantly, as a warning, don't use the I feel statement to try to get others to change. That's the biggest, most common mistake that I see with people sharing feelings. And it goes simply like this. I'm feeling this way when you're doing X, Y, or Z, with the implication, the energy that you need to stop doing what you're doing, so I'm not upset or anxious or scared. And we justify that idea, that exchange, with a sense that we're right, that we love our children, that we love each other. But I can't be more emphatic about it to say that's not real mental health healing, for somebody to do it for you so that you're happy or proud or excited. So we learn to take a step back with the I feel statement. Right? I've shared many times as of late that I've almost arrived at the point, almost, not completely, I've almost arrived at the point where I'm about to suggest to parents that I work with, don't ever share your feelings with your child. And the reason I go to that extreme in my thinking is it's rare that a parent shares a feeling without the implicit idea that it's the child's job to take care of that feeling, to change their behavior. And in the cases where the parent doesn't intend that, which they do often, it still is hard for the child to hold. If your child is pushing you away, if your child is saying things like, it's hard for me to relate to you, and is saying things about you and your interactions that don't make sense to you, what he or she might be saying, there's a likelihood that they're saying is, I can't be responsible. And it seems as though in our relationship, you're making me responsible for your feeling. So finding out, asking yourself very clearly, what's my intention in sharing this? And oftentimes that's why at the end of the day, when you answer the question about why you're doing it, if it's not to change the other person, you might come to the conclusion that it's not necessary to say it. So I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but that's how, in some ways, my thinking has evolved over the years. So here is our version of the I feel statement. We didn't invent it. We kind of looked at all the I feel statements out there, and we created our own format, the one that we liked the best, picking and choosing from people. And it simply goes like this: I feel, and then you state an emotion. If the third word out of your mouth is like or that, you're not sharing an emotion. You're sharing a thought, an idea. I feel this way when, and then you share the event. Do your best to share an observation rather than a judgment. In other words, I felt scared when you left the room while we were talking. That's an observation. Versus, I felt scared when you cut me out. When you gave up on the conversation, gave up on me, right? That example is an observation with a judgment about it, with a conclusion. I've shared this example that one of my first scientific behavioral experiments as an undergrad, we watched small children in preschool, and all we had to do was write down 3 minutes of what they were doing. 3 minutes, that's all we had to do. And nearly everybody in the class failed on their first attempt because all of us were making judgments, coming to conclusions. We were saying things like, student X got frustrated, got tired with the exercise. Student X was impatient or tired, none of which we knew. Instead of saying student X played with the blocks for 3 minutes, turned toward the door, and walked away from the blocks. Right? It is important. If we don't know the difference, this is important. If we don't know the difference between what we see and hear and what we think about it, what conclusion we make out of it, if we don't know the difference between observation and interpretation, we're at a huge disadvantage intrapsychically. Right? we then go around in the world thinking we know what's going on all the time, not owning our own biases, our own filter, our own selves, our own history. It's why when parents say to me, I know my child better than anybody else, it's a worrisome thing for me. I'm sure that you love them the most. That can't be argued. But knowing them the most means that you have to have a great deal of awareness of all of your projections, because our children are our richest destination for our projections, right? I had a client recently tell me that they're becoming more and more aware of how little they know about their adult child. And I was incredibly happy for them. I think it is an evolved, enlightened person that starts to become less sure, that holds on to not knowing, that remains curious and questioning, rather than one that is absolutely confident that what they're seeing and the meaning that they're making out of it is unquestionably true. And then the last part of our particular I feel statement has two parts to it. My hope in the future is, and then we list something that's outside of our control or something that's inside of our control, either order. And I've shared this before, but when we were starting our program in the early days, we were having this debate about whether this skill, this part of the skill, should be included. And some of the folks that were in that room at that table made the argument that we don't want to make the I feel statement a tool for children to manipulate their parents. And my argument was, so expressing a hope for others out loud doesn't make it more manipulative. The unexpressed hope for other people is often going to be more manipulative. So the more explicit we make it, right, the more we just lay it out on the table, the less insidious, the less manipulative, the less covert it is. So you're just identifying it. This is what I hope that you will stop using drugs. And again, when we practice this skill with our children and they know the other side of it, their response is can be, so that's what you want. I see. I hear what you want. I hear what you're hoping for. That takes some strength and some practice, some therapy, some differentiation, but we can learn to leave other people's hopes in front of us as their hopes, instead of believing that we have to do something about it. The other side of the I feel statement, of course, is reflective listening. It has less specifics to it, less details to it, but it's simply reflecting back what you heard. So what you're saying is, and then you try to summarize to the best of your ability what to say. You're not trying to be tricky or interpret or make a deeper meaning out of it. You're just saying, so this is what I hear you saying. And you can ask questions as you go. A lot of people feel like, again, this is a test. It's absolutely perfectly okay to get stuck right out of the gate and to ask the person to repeat themselves. If nothing else, that tells them that you're making an attempt to listen. And then when you're done reflecting, again, a lot of people don't want to be this vulnerable. They just want to say, I know I got it right. I don't want to have to repeat myself. But it's important to say, did I get it right? Is there anything else that I missed or you want to add? And sometimes, we all know this, even if the other person reflects perfectly what we said, after hearing it reflected back to us, we might want to add something or change something. So we keep repeating that last question, keep reflecting it until the other person finishes it. This can be very helpful in the initial phases of treatment. It can be very helpful when things are incredibly charged. But even years and decades later, all throughout our life, the core ideas of these two skills, the core concepts, the core elements of these two skills, I feel statements and reflective listening, ideally are a part of us, right? We're listening to people. We're hearing people. I'm going to talk about kind of 4 different levels of thinking around the I feel statement. And I separate them into sections 100, 200, 300, and 400. Section 100 to begin. State the intent at the beginning of the I feel statement. I want to express myself, I just want to be heard. I think that could be one of the biggest deterrents to arguments, to a back and forth. The second part of that is ask for the intent of the sender if you're the listener. What would you like from me? After listening, hopefully providing some empathy, some compassion, you respond with, what would you like from me? Do you want anything from me? Again, just those two skills. And I talk about this in the 8 Tools broadcast. Just these two things could do so much to get us out of relationship conflict that so many of us, even in our couples, our marriages, get into. Like I said, it's something new. Try something new. Stop the old pattern. Make sure that we don't do it for behavioral changes. Years ago in Los Angeles, when we used to have our parent support groups in Beverly Hills at a program that volunteered some space for us on Rodeo Drive, there was this parent that came to the meeting and shared with some sense of pride about an I feel statement they had shared with their son. He had agreed to help them move. He was a young adult. Then on the morning of, he flaked out on them. And they gave an I feel statement. And the son accused the parents of being manipulative. They denied it, of course. And then they repeated the I feel statement. And everybody else in the room applauded them. I think literally, if I remember correctly. And then I paused and I said, so what was the intent of the I feel statement? And after a couple of questions, it was very clear they absolutely were sharing the I feel statement so that the son would feel some guilt, some sense of obligation, and change his mind about what he was going to do that morning. So he was right. He was right to accuse them of that. So we try not to do it for behavioral changes. We try to ask ourselves honest questions about our intent, about why we're sharing it. That's why I think the first 2 concepts, ask for the intent and share the intent, can kind of help assure, right? That they're kind of a backup to help us make sure, to get us clear on why we're doing it. It helps us to avoid rescuing, the reflective listening, right? When we know that that's our job, to hear, to contain, to listen, to respond to requests for something else if we're asked to do something. We are helped to stay out of rescuing. It promotes differentiation. It's going to feel, folks, this is important for all of you, no matter where you're at. Healthy, assertive communication, healthy boundaries, healthy differentiation are going to feel like awkward distance. They're going to feel like a lack of love and compassion initially for most of us. If we are more on the cut off end of the continuum, we're just going to be impatient and think it's silly or ridiculous, not want to do it at all. But for most of us, most of the parents that I work with who struggle with over-identification, enmeshment, right? Overlapping identity. It's going to feel, and I say that to warn you so that when you feel like you're abandoning your child because you're just listening to them, not rescuing, not reacting. When the child accuses you of not caring, of abandoning them, you have my voice in your head to say, that was predicted. That it was going to feel this way, even be labeled this way. It changes the relationship. It changes where you start and they stop. It changes your relationship with yourself. There's more accountability. There's more honesty with self. There's more of a self, frankly. And then I talk a little bit about learning to hear the I feel statement, right? When somebody says something like, you're a big jerk, you don't care about me, this is BS, whatever it is. Learning to hear the fear, the sadness, and the hurt. And again, it takes practice and time. And when we're more stressed out, we do poorly with this. But the more we do this work, we can hear that without needing to react to it. It's not about us. We tell our children how we feel so that we can be present with them and more intentional in our response to them. I want to say that again. We tell our children how we feel so that we can be present with them and more intentional in our response to them. Communication 200, pitfalls and the proper use. Be careful of returning an I feel with an I feel statement. I always say there needs to be a pause, right? The original I feel has to have its time in the spotlight on stage. And when we return an I feel with an I feel, we're oftentimes just arguing about who's right? We've just cloaked a debate beneath the skills of the I feel, but we're really not listening to each other. So give it some space and some time. That impulse to that need to share an I feel, again, is evidence of the value of giving the space. If you've spent enough time giving the sender what you think is the adequate space, you've empathized, you've listened, you've validated, you've even owned some of the parts that they've observed, perhaps. You can ask the sender if they're open to an I feel statement in return. But be careful of that. Most people will say yes, and they're not ready. It still ends up sounding to them like you're justifying, arguing, debating with them, dismissing theirs. So be reluctant to return an I feel with an I feel. Reacting to the I feel or clarifying facts. It is the most common mistake in reflective listening. Absolutely. And we feel justified. We feel the need when we get told not to. We start to believe that we're insane, or we're indulging the other person, or we're reinforcing their self-delusional victimhood. All those things. And yet it's important. Not clarifying, not putting them in their place, telling them how it is really. Just leaves it with them. You still get to hold your boundaries. You still get to say no. You still get to stand where you stand. And this is important. People exaggerate oftentimes because they don't feel heard, right? You know, if I just came home from work, you were at home waiting for me, and I told you a small little thing that my boss did and that I was upset, I would be afraid that you would say, well, that's not a big deal. Why are you so upset? So what do? I exaggerate the story. I talk about how they always do it, how everybody thinks they're this way, about how heinous the act was, so that you're more likely to say, well, gosh, no wonder you're so upset. So the more we listen, the more we contain. In my experience, across the board, the more likely people are come to a more shared experience, shared observation of what has gone on. Be accountable even for their part in it. Imperatives, exaggerations, or thinking errors. You know, all those things can come into play. Have to, must, need to, should, good, bad, right, wrong. Made me feel, right? Blaming somebody for my feelings. After giving an I feel, ask for a reaction, being open to the response. I tend, in my own personal life, to not want a response. It's because my experience that most people who give a response are intending to justify, rationalize, dismiss, erase my feelings. So I just rather sit with it. It doesn't take long. Sometimes it's a matter of minutes. Once I know I'm allowed to sit with and feel my feelings, they become much easier to release, actually. And again, a big pitfall that so many people step into is they think they're more capable of having discussions with a back and forth than they really are or are ready to have. So watch for that. Level 300, the difference between behaviorism and connection. This is not a tool to reinforce or to discourage behavior. This is about connection to self and to others. I've said, when I train our therapists, I ask them to tone down their praise, to tone down their excitement when a new student has a great week or two. It's akin to the idea of Don't get so loud in the audience that your child loses focus on the task at hand, right? Present a mild reinforcement. Things like, you can be proud of yourself, or how does that feel to you? Or congratulations. Sounds like you really wanted that. Sounds like you worked hard. Those are much better than the, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. That's a great job. I'm so happy for you. Those tend to load very heavily onto children's shoulders. Questions are statements, and statements are questions. It's just, again, identifying the meta-communication. Oftentimes when clients and students are giving each other feedback, we distinguish between the two. They'll be asking a question, leading questions, looking for a specific answer. And I say, why don't you just share your observations and thoughts and ask them what they think, instead of trying to lead them to an answer. Don't you think that your parents felt this way? Don't you think if you did it this way, this would happen? What do you think will happen if you do this in all of your relationships? So on and so forth. Instead of saying, in my experience is when I do it this way, this is what happens. So make sure your questions are questions, looking for information, and your statements are statements. Why is usually not a question. Why in relationships is usually a statement. Why did you do that? Usually does not mean why did you do that. It usually means I don't like what you did. Why can't I come home? Why can't I call my parents? Why can't I go out tonight? It's usually just a clever way to introduce a debate. Repeating I feel statements over and over again. I find this in my relationships all the time. When somebody repeats an I feel statement a couple of times, I'll often pause and say, I think I've heard this and reflected it. Is there something that you want from me that I'm not giving to you? Just to clarify. I sometimes repeat I feel statements. Find myself saying, you know what? I've already said this. I'm just really upset. I'm looking for a pound of flesh or something else. And so I'm just going to sit with this right now. And inflammatory information in the I feel statement. You know, it's easy to load in, especially to the I feel this way because I think part of it. It's incredibly easy to load in insulting and judgmental comments. I feel this way because I think you're being a jerk. Right? Because I think you don't care. Because I think you hate me. Because I think you give up, whatever it is. Empathy. Empathy is a higher level, right? Ideally, we provide empathy. And empathy takes work. To provide empathy for a teenager or a young adult who's doing ridiculous things in their life takes a humility. And we're afraid to give it. We're afraid to empathize with our children because we're afraid, again, it's going to reinforce, condone, right, what they're doing. And again, it's that attempt to try to control that gets in the way of authentic connection, healing, and growth for both people. Be patient. When this first starts, I teach your students, your children, your students and clients, I teach them, don't overcorrect. Try to listen to the spirit of the I feel statement. It's not a test about getting it right. There's some basic concepts and tools in here that can be very helpful as guiding concepts and tools and principles. But the more evolved we become, the more differentiated we become, the more leeway we have for others in their I feel statement. And level 400, internalizing it. Be willing to stop and take a time out. Sleep on it. Be willing to not interrupt. And again, I want to be clear. I feel sad, happy, mad, scared is about owning the feeling, not choosing it. Let's say, this is not true of me, but let's say I was abused by my father and you go to pat me on the shoulder and I shrink instinctually out of fear that you're going to hurt me. Because my experience is people that touch me hurt me. I'm not choosing to feel afraid, but it is mine. Based on my history, my filter, my psychological construct. And if I work in therapy on that over, most likely in this case, a long period of time, I can learn to choose out of that. But I feel is not about choice. It's about ownership. I own it. It's mine. Even if the behavior, everybody in the room would agree that the behavior would trigger a similar feeling in them, it still is yours to own. Natural or street I feel statements and reflections, you can become more casual once you become an expert. And when you decide you're an expert, I don't know. But if it comes from that place, like I said, of I'm beyond this, and this is too simple, or this feels contrived, if it's early on in your process, I would challenge that. Family systems theory talks about relationships. That's the biggest difference between family systems, the family therapy movement of the 1970s, and individual psychology. They measured, looked at, observed what went on in relationships versus what went on inside of an individual. They explained things by cycles, by dynamics, by patterns, and by relationships. And Salvador Minuchin identified enmeshment as one end of a continuum. He said it was like hands being clasped together. People that were too close, reactive or dependent. Clear boundaries, he said, were somewhere in the middle of this continuum. And then disengaged where people were cut off from each other. Murray Bowen came along and redefined these IDs, these concepts, used different terms. And he said fusion, right, which is that enmeshment idea, too close, reactive, dependent, and cutoff are other sides of the same coin, opposite sides of the same coin. Both are a lack of differentiation. Differentiation is on the other end of the continuum. And cutoff or enmeshment are just stylistically different. They're not fundamentally different. They're just a lack of capacity to have intimate / differentiated relationships. So what's the goal of the communication? Ask yourself that before you speak. Consider not telling your children how you feel. If your intent is for them to feel some sort of obligation to take care of your feeling, to manage it, to make it go away. The response that many have is this is not enough. Obviously, there's more in communication than the I feel statement and reflective listening. There's more to it. However, I will tell you that this, in terms of dealing with difficulties, the core concepts, tools embedded in the I feel statement are incredibly important. They teach us a lot about what it means to be in a relationship. When I was talking and doing my fancy therapy in the early days, I started to learn real quickly. People said, well, what does it look like? And I started to remember, it kind of looks like an I feel statement. It kind of looks like just listening. That's what it looks like. What if only one person is going to participate? I absolutely believe that this skill and tool can be effective if only one person does it. I try to carry this around inside of my head as much as I can. Both sides of the equation. I try to hear people when they're talking as talking about themselves. And I try to own the various parts. And it's hard. I would much rather talk about you and your problems than I would talk about my feelings of insecurity or inadequacy or anxiety or fear or sadness or hurt. It's much easier to disown those feelings and to focus on what's wrong with you. Much easier. It's the difference between interpersonal differentiation and intrapsychic differentiation. Minuchin said interpersonal differentiation is this connection, right? It's balanced with individuation. Intrapsychic differentiation is knowing the separate parts of myself, knowing the difference between a feeling, an observation, a thought, and a desire. And being able to relate all of them to each other, but knowing the distinction between each of them. That's about ownership, personal accountability. Listen to what people are not saying. It's like the CEO, after having a wonderful therapeutic experience, goes back to his team and says, hey, I want more feedback. I want more communication coming up the ladder. And everybody at the boardroom table, silent as can be. And what was that telling that CEO? It was telling them that people didn't feel safe. It's not about you. What people say and think is not about you. You can ask questions about it. Going back to the example that I shared before about somebody, you tapping me on my shoulder, having been an abused child, and me jerking in fear. If I tell you that, if I ask you not to touch me without permission because I struggle with that, you can say yes to that. If I ask you for something that doesn't violate a core piece of yourself, and of course in this example it wouldn't, you can do that. Absolutely. But it's not about you. It's about them. It's like the 4 agreements that I've been referring to a lot lately. What somebody thinks about you is not about you. What they say about you is not about you. If they say you're the worst, it's not about you. If they say you're the best, it's not about you. Listen, listen, listen. We all can do better at listening. And that's why I write on here, and know you're not doing a good job at this. And that's sort of tongue-in-cheek to say, everybody that I know can do a better job at listening. I've never met anybody who's flawless at it. Even my own therapist, and I revere her skills and experience to the utmost, right? In her late 70s, sometimes loses the ability to listen to me. And we talk about that. So we're all human in this way. All right, I'm happy to answer any live questions that have come in. One parent writes, please remind me where you get these slides and also to see the webinar again. Is it posted on YouTube? Thanks. Yes. You go to the parent portal and you can just search the webinars there. It'll have the 5 most recent. You can search them by name or keyword. And then the slides are in the portal are there. You can download the slides there. You can watch the slides as you watch the video, listen to the audio. Next question, is an I feel statement a kind of taking ownership of the feeling? And is taking ownership of guilt or shame a beginning element of healing from guilt? I think so. Yeah, I would say yes to both. Right? I mean, we were handed, and I would assume almost all cases, we were handed the guilt and shame. And the experience, the example that I gave where my father was abusing me, that was given to me. But then over time, it becomes mine to own. And that's hard for parents because we do so good at saying, oh, we can't blame our parents for our lives, right? We're beyond that. We have that experience inside of ourselves. We have the delusion, actually, of conscious, easy choice. So we say, it's ours now. But we have such a hard time then saying to our children, it's theirs. Yes, we dented our children. Yes, we handed off our wounds, our baggage to them. Not because we were bad people, but because we were human people. And then as they grow, it's theirs to own, to sort out. If we're going to be in their lives in a meaningful way, we are going to be present and work that out with them. Listen to them in therapy. Listen to their letters. Hear why they're angry. Understand their experience. But absolutely, it does help with the guilt and shame part of it. If a parent and child are in an enmeshed or codependent relationship, what are the most common communication failures? Will a healthy I feel statement, the healthy listening response, lead away to healthier balance? It can guide you, absolutely. The biggest mistakes are reactivity, right? Getting triggered. It's kind of the paramount characteristic of codependency. Feeling responsible for each other's feelings. Feeling responsible for each other's sense of self, success. So it's complex, and that's why the I feel statement simplifies it, right? It becomes the anatomy, if you will, of what an intimate, differentiated relationship will look like. And I want to be clear about this. When I say intimate and differentiated, those are synonymous. You know, we always think of intimacy as, most people would define intimacy, one of the first words they would use is closeness, right? But the problem with that idea is that intimacy requires separateness, differentiation, independence, right? Imagine a Buddhist monk sitting with an angry individual on death row, blaming the world, not taking any responsibility, attacking the monk, accusing everybody of every wrongdoing, saying how they were wrong. The Buddhist monk, in this kind of hypothetical, would be hearing their pain, their sadness, their powerlessness, their fear, and their suffering. This Buddhist monk wouldn't be interpreting it by saying, well, look how wrong they are, look at the self-pity, look at how mentally ill they are, right? They would see them. And because they would see them in all the ways that I just described, they would respond with compassion and patience. They wouldn't try to prove anything, justify themselves, argue with the individual about what the individual thought about them. So intimacy requires distance. And I think most of us, we're not taught that. We don't know that. It becomes part of an enlightenment process for most of us. Another parent asks, after they are home for a few years now, how do we deal with how angry they are? You stole 3 years of my life. They're just allowed to be angry. You say things like, I may have been wrong. I'm sorry. I'm sorry it didn't help you. I thought I was doing the best that I could. You just learn to be wrong. Learn to lose. Right? You don't try to argue. You don't hope they get over it or past it. Right? They feel that energy. I had a father say to me at a parent support group years ago, he said, Brad, I did everything that you said to my daughter. I listened and I listened and I listened. I reflected and I reflected, and she's still upset. And I said, in your question lies the problem. You still had an investment in her letting go. And she felt that. So you just learn to be wrong. Apologize. Let them be angry. And I've seen it, folks. I know it's hard to do as a father or a mother. It's monumentally difficult. But I've seen it. When you just let it go through you. Admit the possibility that you could have been wrong, that it was a mistake. There's nowhere to go with it. They just have to own it. But when there's rigidness, stiffness about it, when we have an investment, a need for them to get over it, when we leak that need, they can feel that. How do you teach the child right and wrong when you're detaching from their process, sort of waiting for them to see it for themselves? My experience is you teach children right and wrong by teaching them how to feel. And when children learn how to feel, they're compassionate and loving toward others. That's how you teach them right and wrong. There are spaces to talk about your experience. Look at the 8 Tools broadcast. Listen to or watch the 8 Tools broadcast. Read the 8 Tools blog that I wrote. And there's this, children know this sense of right or wrongness. But it gets confused with them with this angst, this feeling, this pain, this suffering. I aspire to never teach my children right from wrong by what I lecture, what I say. And yet I would say my children are incredibly moral and sensitive people. It doesn't come through lectures, through preaching, through teaching. You know what they do to each other? They do that ad nauseum to each other. They lecture to each other all the time. What they don't do to each other easily is listen. So teaching a human being how to feel is the best way to help them develop morality. Listening to them is the best way to teach morality. Next question. I have found in using the I feel statement when including the hope for others and myself, I am much more intentional in the content and looking at why I want to share my feelings. Sometimes I decide not to share when I get to that point in my head, realizing that I'm realizing that I really want to try to get somebody else to see my side. I like the addition of the statement. Thank you. I'm happy. I'm glad for that. I want you just to give it a chance, to try it on, to learn about it, to dive into it. I was taught this I feel statement when I was 8 years old, a version of this, because I was in trouble and in therapy when I was 8 years old. And I remember how thinking it was so ridiculous. So for 42 plus years, I've known about the I feel statement and the reflective listening concept, the idea, the tool. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I saw the richness of it, that I saw the ubiquitous application of it in our lives. And while I don't use the formal 5-step process every day by any means, I aspire to use the core concepts of ownership, I feel, when this happens. And it takes a great deal of strength and vulnerability versus talking about somebody else and how they made me feel. All right. On social media, you can find these broadcasts on the podcast app. On the iPhone, iOS device, use the podcast app. On Android devices, download the SoundCloud app, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Evoke Therapy Programs, any one of those formats, and subscribe there. On Twitter and Instagram, find us at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. Find the Evoke Family Foundation on Facebook if you want to become involved in an alumni organization that helps people that can't afford treatment. Go to the Evoke Therapy blog for new content. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon, the paperback version, also the audio version. If you want to do what I think is the best thing that you can do for yourself and your family and your child, go to an intensive. The next one is June 6th or 10th. We may have one spot available. If you're interested, go then. The next one is July 18th through 22nd. I can think of nothing better to honor, to support, to respect this process, to create something that will create a meaningful foundation for maintaining the skills and tools that your child has started while at Evoke. You can go to our website for all the dates. Finding You 2 is almost full. That's October 10th through 14th. Coming soon will be an alumni intensive for any former Evoke Wilderness Therapy client, 18 years of age and older. You can also do customized family intensives. Professional growth workshops. The next women's one with an opening is September 9th through 11th. The next men's one with an opening is June 10th through 12th. Contact us by emailing intensives@evoketherapy.com for more questions. I will be in New York City this Monday. It's the last parent support group before my sabbatical. Monday, June 4th, 7 to 9 p.m. in Midtown. Email Melanie@evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. We would like all families, if possible, to come to a workshop. It's a 2-day workshop, June 23rd and 24th. The next one is at our Entrada location in southern Utah. You can combine that with a visit to see your child if the therapist that your child works with thinks it's appropriate. Contact Gail@evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. Pursuits trips are high adventure trips, camping, fishing, hiking, mountain biking, river rafting, trekking, trips for young adults or for families. Think sober fun or therapy light. All right, folks, my next broadcast will be next Wednesday, June 6th at 7 p.m. It will be about preparing for transition and also exploring relapse and regression. Thank you for and on behalf of your child for joining these. Thank you for the heroic work that you're doing to look at yourself in this process. Frankly, most people are afraid of that. Most people don't want to look at themselves, and so I honor the fact that you all show up at these, listen to these either archived or live. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.